All right. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of Sovereign Mindset Podcast. Today I have on Alain. Alain, what's your last name?
Leon.
Alain Leon.
Yeah.
Alain is a engineer. He's a technologist. I think of him as a philosopher, someone who likes to think critically of the world. And I brought him on today to speak a little bit about COVID and just jump into a few other conversations. We're just going to be having a friendly conversation here and pondering about the world a little bit. So, welcome.
Yeah, good of you to have me on. Lots of things to ponder about. And by the way, I consider everybody a philosopher, whether they know it or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's especially nowadays, right? Because things are definitely changing fast and people are having to think hard about their lives and the world in general just because of how far we've shifted in the last year. Um, so yeah, I guess to start off, we could kind of give our positions on COVID, how like a general like outlook on how we view the situation. I think that would help set a the perspective of where we're coming from. So
Yeah.
do you want to
Okay.
start? You want to start off there?
Well, I'll start out with at first it was just scary, right? I'm watching those YouTube videos of like Chinese people dropping to the ground and all these reports of the police in China locking people in their apartments. And at the time it wasn't here, right? And I guess in a sense, I was like, well, maybe this will be like the original SARS, which really didn't hit us, and so on and so forth. So I was watching it from afar and not terribly worried. And then when it starts hitting Italy and they start locking up and it starts moving across the Western world, then it's like, what the heck is this? Who do I trust? Who do I go to for information? Like you said, I like to think I'm a critical thinker. I'm also an engineer. So for these type of things, I turn on that, I put on that technical hat. But this is, I don't know anything about viruses. So who do I end up believing? How do I get to that information? That was an issue I had back in the day.
Yeah, trying to figure out the severity of it, trying to figure out what's actually happening. We had so many conflicting reports, and then with social media, everything gets kind of, let's just say, sensationalized, right?
Sensationalized, jumbled. It a lot of what you get in social media, unless you already have certain sources that you can go to, it's just not information. It just gets you more worried, and it's not information that you can use to calm yourself down and try and figure out what's happening, which is where I was at the time. It's like, what's happening? I think to your original question, sort of my bias and where I come from, which is what I think helps me, is that I believe that there are, powerful influence, people who have influence and control out there and on either side of the political spectrum and elsewhere that are invested in making you have a narrative and have certain ideas about things, because that gives them more power and more control. So with that mindset, I'm always like moving carefully and trying to figure out what is fact from fiction.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you really got to have your like critical thinking lens on and really like parse through all the information that's coming and also put it into that perspective as well, that there are forces out there that create narratives for their own interests. And that's kind of how I approached this early on. I saw the videos from China, basically, really sensationalized videos. You got people like, I mean, that looks absolutely ridiculous now in today's perspective, because you had people, just dropping to the floor like flies. It just seemed like now it just seems like really hardcore propaganda, to paint a certain spooky narrative of this virus. And but I caught on to the narrative really early on, because after being on the internet and Twitter for so long, I've kind of learned how to search for, I would say, information that kind of yields more to the actual events of things.
Hmm.
I also learned how to pinpoint certain people as being um, trustworthy. I guess you would say, because we all see what the mainstream media is like right now. But and so I caught onto the narrative real quick, listening to podcasts of epidemiologists and all of that stuff. And in February, I wrote a long letter to my family where I warned them. I said, "Hey, listen, this is what's coming." And it was just, I could read that letter to you today, and it's exactly the standard narrative that they're using right now. And then as I started to kind of see what's happening out in the real world, I started to notice that the narrative that they were giving us, with the high R0, with the high death rate, with the, these models that they use to predict millions and millions of people would die. I started to notice that that's not making a lot of sense. I actually caught on to that pretty early, in the middle of March, when they actually started the lockdowns. I was like, wait a second, if all of this stuff of the virus you're saying is true, and this narrative is what you want me to believe, we should be seeing carnage out there in the streets right
Yeah.
now, right? We should be seeing families being torn apart because three of their members have died, like this. And then I don't want to ramble on too long, but that's where I'm at right now. I just see a large deviation from what the original narrative was to what we're seeing now actually play out in reality.
Yeah. So that is difficult for everybody to try and piece together, right? You get that first report out of it was Imperial College. So these folks out there, they come out with this report that essentially says that 3.4% of people are going to die. And although at first, for those who don't know, 3.4% is extremely high. That is millions of people dying. And sort of that's where what a lot of governments hold on to. Definitely, the UK, they start their lockdowns. At first they didn't have lockdowns, and when after dealing with those scientists and that story, Imperial College, 3.4 million, they start their lockdown. They say this is going to be way worse than anybody thought, and that's it. Almost seems not. It almost seems that was what everybody was using as a reference point, and by everybody I mean the governments. Now, what one of the things, at least for me, that got me to start thinking, I was already skeptical just because of my nature, but I was also saying, okay, well, that's my nature. How do I really know? And one of the things that came up for me right away, and this is part of the good part of social media, right? So the good part of social media is that, you know, uh, they do give you articles and they start getting to know your habits. And one of the articles that came across, I think it was social media, almost sure of it, was a report from one of the most important scientists, I think, these days, and definitely one of the most cited ones. So he's been cited thousands and thousands of times and peer reviewed, which was John Ioannidis. And John Ioannidis, I knew him. I've been reading his work. He has one of the things that made him really famous was the work for most published research is wrong. So he proved, like probably over a decade ago, why most of the studies that people read and people cite, and most of that research that comes out is either completely wrong or has some serious issues in it. And he was able to go through it. And because of that work has been cited immensely, and a bunch of other stuff. The guy has been around here for decades. So one of the first things he does, he just starts looking at the data. And he really is somebody that is generally, I would say, non-biased. He's not one of these people that either side really calls upon. He's famous only because he's put out a bunch of reports, and he starts looking at those cases that got locked up in the cruise ships. Remember, it was like off of Japan. I mean, it seems like years ago, but this was really less than a year ago, right? So he starts looking at that case and he's like, well, the Imperial College, that 3.4%, those are essentially simulations. That's not a number they arrived from hard data. And this is one point that I have that I think that if I was to tell folks something to get a clue on what's valid information or what you should think about more, is that there are classifications of studies. What they did were essentially simulations. In other words, they're kind of thinking, based on these numbers, we ran a computer model and this is what it gave us. A computer model is not reality.
And it just seems like such a small sample there too. I mean, to extrapolate what the what the consequences of the virus could be on the global population, or to even extrapolate that, the 4%, close to 4% death rate that you were saying. It just seems, is that where they got it, from the cruise ship?
No, they didn't get it from the cruise ship. So it was just a model of what they thought the R rating would be based on very small data, and they started running on what we know for previous viruses and so on and so forth. And so they extrapolated that and they created this model, and the media, everybody else runs with it and calls it a study. For most people, when they hear the word study, it's only one word. They think, oh, everything, it's legit. It's real. It's like scientists were, with their lab coats somewhere, running experiments. And that's not at all what this was. This was essentially some folks getting numbers as best as they could, but your bias seeps in there a lot when you do that, right? So then Ioannidis, that's his name, John Ioannidis, this is the person I'm talking about. He knows that for him, those really don't count, and he starts looking at actual data, and the actual data from the very few cases we had at the time was from these cruise ships. The first one, I forget what the name was, but it was, I think, off of the coast of Japan. And he starts looking at it and he's like, well, the evidence that we have thus far is, several times less than what you're talking about. And although it was a cruise ship of, I think at the time was like 700 folks, I don't remember exactly, but it was around there. It was a good scenario, or at least something to look at. And he was like, given what I see, we're really nowhere near those numbers of 3.4%. And interestingly enough, the range that he gave, I think, was from about given the actual numbers of infections and what happened in that cruise ship, was somewhere, I think, between 0.5 to 1%. I'll have to look at it. But it was several times less than what the Imperial College had. And that's what got me thinking. That's like, okay, these people are running just models of what they think and all these R values and all these other things. And Ioannidis actually has hard data, even though it's, just some of the few samples that we have, but it's several times before, less than that. So there's where I got my first hint that maybe it's not as these people were saying.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, I mean, I my first hint was more intuition. It was just like, hey, man, based off what they're saying, if we just take that number, or we take those numbers and we kind of extrapolate out a little bit, this virus has been here since probably January. And if it's been here since January, we were in Miami, we were in South Beach. We saw the Super Bowl and how many people came in. It was literally,
I remember that.
Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world. We had tons of Italians, right? Tons of, I'm sure, tons of Chinese. And, by that point, the virus had already kind of spread. And I was just thinking, this is not adding up. It's not adding up. This catastrophe that they're talking about is not what it seems.
Serious, right? But the question is, so that's almost like your bias. We all have a bias. That's the way of our approaching stuff. How do other people that don't have that bias go about it? If they're really trying to put forth an effort, which for me, it kind of sucks, right? Because if you think about it, most people are just living their lives, with their family, with their loved ones. They kind of depend on the experts to tell them the truth of what's going on without not having to think, is they're just not experts. But now, because everything is so politicized, you have to devote time to this, and you have to almost have a system that when a story comes up, you got to go, okay, how do I go about this? Because,
well, you know what, and that's what I find. I think I've tweeted about this or wrote about this, but that's what I find really hard right now for people to wrap their head around is that these institutions and the experts that they've been led to trust, well, they might not be as trustworthy as people think. And so what do you do? And for me, I've been critical of kind of the media and the government, and I've kind of seen the corruption all the way since like 2008. I've started noticing it more and more, especially like with the Ron Paul campaign and the way the
Hmm.
media treated him. And I just said, oh wow, this is an institution that has no problem being corrupt when it's in their interest to do so. There's and for me, immediately I say, okay, well then, if someone lies to you constantly, right, and
Hmm.
has no problem lying to you, well, you're gonna lose trust in their integrity. And so I lost trust in the integrity of the media and the government a long time ago. So I always view information through a critical lens. I've already developed that skill to kind of parse the internet and parse out the propaganda from what's fact and what's fiction, and kind of know also, I don't even have to know what the truth is. I just have to know when I'm being bullshitted, or I have to be. So that's another part. It's like, hey, I don't know what the truth is, but all I know is that makes no sense right there, or that sounds, or that's a blatant lie, based on whatever factors there are that can reveal that to you. But yeah, so I do want to kind of touch back onto what you were saying, and that is in regards to how they use these models and they use these kind of studies, right, quote unquote, to now go to governments and go to Congress and go to these places and make policies. And this is
Yeah.
what we're seeing is that these lockdown policies, these are now kind of looking like they're based off of not bad science, but bad data. And you could say bad science because science is a process, a discovery process, right? And
Yeah.
and if something gets corrupted in that discovery process, well, it could lead you to the wrong results or to the wrong conclusions. And it just seems like what you're saying there is happening, that this bad
Yeah.
science, this bad data has led to really bad policies. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is that I've noticed definitely that folks that are normally on third parties, you mentioned Ron Paul, but I've also seen it a lot with other third parties. They almost have an intuitive sense and have been put into situations where they see how the narrative works against them, right? If you're probably in one of the two major parties, you don't see it as much. But with the other parties, like, you could see how they tried to, when the Yang Gang was happening and Andrew Yang and that whole deal, how they they wouldn't give him any time, and so you see that push, you see that control come
Can I just
through.
say something real quick there on that point? It's one of those things where people might say, "Oh yeah, look at especially nowadays, it's so easy to throw that right wing pejorative out there, as anyone who thinks critically is a right winger, and anyone who questions things in that regard is a right winger. How can you question the system? But like liberals or Democrats can see the same thing have happened to
Yeah,
their party in 2016 with Bernie Sanders, and how
yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah,
that
for sure.
all the fraud and corruption that occurred there. And it's just so to think that can't happen. I mean, it's happened to their side as well, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah. The
and
Bernie Sanders, I have quite a good few friends of mine that are Bernie supporters, and they're still livid about that. They remember it very well. For me personally, it was I just remember the whole Iraq war. I remember how Colin Powell, I still remember, he was sitting there in front of the UN with the vials of whatever, right? And so I remember for years what came out of that, and I was like, wow, I believed Colin Powell, and it wasn't just a matter of believing or not believing him. I thought he was somebody that was trustworthy, but that's really when you start thinking there's like this whole system, like almost this apparatus, and you catch yourself, is this conspiracy theory? Am I going down the rabbit hole? Or but there's definitely, I think most people, if you ask them right now, I think they think there is people who have influence, who have power, who have control, and they're using that to exert it on the wider population.
sure. And so but like, just going back to that, I do want to address that is one aspect of it, but I just want to address the practical aspect of the lockdowns as far
Yeah.
as
So when it comes to that with a lockdown, so you brought up the whole point of science. And science these days almost like a politicized word is like, wow, it's like everybody tries to attach to it. But at least one of the things that we can point to, one of the things that I pointed to is like, okay, what were the standard procedures before this? So I had to go out and really find out, what WHO, what was historically done. And historically done, definitely the standard procedure was not to lock down entire cities, countries. The standard procedure was to lock down, if we want to use that phrase, or really just quarantine the people that were sick. That was it. That was it. Even if you go back, interesting that you brought in the Super Bowl, right? That happened here in Miami, which is where I'm at, because Fauci was asked about the Super Bowl. He was specifically asked about the Super Bowl, and he said it wasn't going to be a big deal. So regarding the lockdowns up until 2020, the standard procedure was just to quarantine the people that were sick.
yeah. So with that, thing that bothers me about the lockdown. So number one, I just look at it from a moral perspective. It's just a complete violation of our human rights. Number one, and even if it did work, even if it was one of those things, I think to use the force of government to impose like these really draconian restrictions that are a violation of the fundamental principles which are a bedrock to our society and allow for civilization to flourish and cooperate. I think that just from a moral perspective, that's wrong. Then from a practical perspective, I also see lockdowns as something that was done completely uh, in a way that's almost anti-science. It's like totally illogical because it's not it is the same methods that they used in medieval times. Everybody stay in your house, lock your doors. You know what I mean? And it's like, well, have we not, you know,
Progressed.
progressed a little bit? And then not only that, but you also have to consider the trade-offs. And this is one of the things that always bother me. No one considered the trade-offs when proposing for these lockdowns. All right. The trade-offs, like how many people are going to die from suicide? How much economic damage is going to be caused? How much unemployment is going to happen? And what are the deaths that are going to result from that? And I just don't feel like there was any consideration given to that from, let's just say, people in media and people in the government. Of course, maybe there was some, but for the general, basically what the apparatus wants to push out there, they, anyone that even posed that concern to them was demonized in a way. It's saying like, oh my
Yeah, that
God,
was
you want.
interesting.
Yeah.
That was interesting, right? I would tend to agree with you there that side of it was missing from the argument, and it was demonized. And I was figuring out, why is this being demonized? And it was being demonized, at least a conclusion that I got to, is because they're putting it as lives versus money, right? It was like, well, I'm talking to you about saving lives, and you're talking to me about just money.
Yep.
No, that it's just greed. And I was like, that's when I realized that oftentimes language could be a huge barrier, because people will talk about the economy, and really, at least for me, when I talk about the economy, I talk about like everyday lives, like impact in people's lives. And to other people, that just means money.
No, I mean that means people's livelihoods. That means how they
Yeah.
put food on the table. It means their plans and their dreams. And when people lose hope, right? I mean, we become a very depressed society,
Yeah.
and that in itself, the psychological toll. No one considered these things, and it's really it was just, let's take this hammer and let's just start whacking things down, and that'll make it go away without any consideration to the collateral damage, the first order, second order, third order effects that would occur. And the also having a long-term view, because an economy is not something that you can turn off and turn right back on, especially one that's been highly indebted. There is a lot of, let's just say, um, untangling that needs to occur before productivity comes back into the
Yeah.
mix. And so I think that we haven't even started to see, we're printing a bunch of money right now and things feel good, but we haven't even begun to see what the consequences are. And then, um, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I
Yeah,
mean, it's
on
fun.
that one, yeah.
It's fun talking about this stuff, but I just want to go back to the lockdowns also and talk about how, we're in Florida. We were probably locked down for a month, at least where I was at. And it wasn't lockdown. It was just like, hey guys, shut down your business
Yeah.
and let's all chill out. And that was like a month. And then things reopened. And I moved out of Miami because Miami is to me it went full on like totalitarian. My threshold
Okay.
is low though. And
Yeah.
so I moved to a place where it was open the whole time and no one
Yeah.
really changed their behaviors. And it highlighted to me just the absurdity of lockdown. It's like, how is it in some places they're not locked down, like I guess Sweden, and
Yeah.
they weren't, you would expect based off of what they were projecting, based off the information they were pushing out there, that Sweden would be absolutely ravaged because lockdown is the only way to prevent this virus. Now,
Yeah.
are you noticing that absurdity, that complete disconnect there?
Well, so it's interesting, right? Because again, I put myself, knowing myself, I try to identify my biases, but I also try and ask the question, okay, somebody that does not have these biases, how do they go around this problem? So at the time, the stories, the narrative, me chatting on my friends with Facebook, with family members was like, listen, we don't know what the heck this thing is. Let's just shut down for a little bit. We'll flatten the curve. Remember, that was like the goal in life, was like to flatten the curve. And once we get a handle on this, then things will get back to normal. So in Miami, we did lock down. They closed everything. Nobody was going to work. Everybody was wearing masks. Everybody was inside their house, and everybody was running very, very scared. I had a friend that I had to take toilet paper to. She was down to using tissues. And I remember dropping it off in front of her door and stepping back into the stairwell. And there's when she opened, and like she looked at me, and the minute she saw me, she just started crying. And I'm like, "Why are you crying?" And she's like, "Well, I haven't seen a human being in over a month." And I'm like, "Wow, you know?"
That's, see, I mean, people don't understand the psychological toll that has on people. it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah. No, it's so for people at the time, people weren't sure. They were getting information from here, from there. Like the folks more like yourself that were like, "Listen, this is not a big deal. Go on about your lives." And then the other people telling them this is going to be a total disaster. Millions and millions of people are going to die. So that was I think that was the narrative for the lockdowns. We definitely did not have as much information about the virus as we do now. And the goal was to flatten the curve. And we did, right? The curve was flattened. What definitely I started seeing is that even as more information was coming out, and even though the curve was flattening, like they weren't, the whole lockdown approach was still like full on in many places in the United States and the world,
well,
with the exception of like Sweden and something like that, which we can talk about, because I immediately, once that started happening in Sweden, I was like, okay, I can hold on to this, listen to the experts from there. That was a beacon for me. Sweden ended up being a beacon for me to compare experts and opinions and go about this, figuring out the puzzle.
yeah, Sweden. So Sweden is one of those things where it's like, I guess, what would you call it in scientific terms? It's your constant, or
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
it's
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 the
the, it's the control.
the control. It's the control. And
But
interesting to know. So right, so the Imperial College guys, the people that were using the 3.4%, that people were going to die, they actually did a model for Sweden as well, right? So the model for Sweden was, if Sweden does nothing, what they're doing, they're going to lose 90,000 people within 6 months. That never, they were just completely off there, like they were in
That's
everywhere
what
else.
that's what, you know. I don't mean to cut you off, but it's really one of those things that really upset me about all of this. None of these people are going to face consequences. The amount of devastation that they've caused based off their models being wrong, or based off of giving this false confidence into their projections, and actually taking this to whatever governments and saying, hey, this is what it's going to be, and instilling all this fear in the population to take these measures that are absolutely devastating in my opinion, like lockdowns and masks and all of that stuff. They really, I feel like, bamboozled, for a lack of a better word.
Bamboozled, yeah.
Yeah, the scientific establishment, as well as the government, not to, and that's to say that the government didn't want that. Maybe they pushed for that study, but I would see how that would be very beneficial to a government. When you say, hey, there's a catastrophe on the horizon, I mean, they look at that and they see opportunity. So I'm not implying that I'm just saying that there would be very little pushback to a catastrophic study, in my opinion, by government. They would welcome that opportunity, because governments naturally just want to take over more control. And at least that's my perspective. I don't think that people right now can look at what's happening in certain areas and think that government is benevolent. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's always that aspect to it. I think there's always that aspect to it, and I'm probably closer to you into believing that aspect to it as well. But even without that aspect, we're both in crypto. We look at crypto, and one of the big questions in these projects in crypto is governance, right, and incentives. And definitely politicians, and even the scientists, a lot of them, they don't have skin in the game. They, like you say, they suffer no consequences for being wrong, and they suffer an immense amount of consequences, um, um, for I mean, for like, when they're right, and they suffer nothing for being wrong. So if, let's say they would have said nothing is going to happen, everything is going to be fine, and this thing turns out to be a disaster, all the attention in the world is on them. But if they say this thing is going to be a disaster and nothing happens, it's like, okay, no big deal. And
The incentives are perverted there, as
yeah,
far as
the incentives are wrong. The incentives are, let me not say wrong, but they're not appropriate to the best outcome that we would want. Because when you really have to put money in the game, skin in the game, as they say, that's really when you start taking things into account. And so even without going the government, they wanted to do this from the beginning, which, there's an aspect of that. As you say, I do believe that governments generally want more power and control. But even without that, you could just see that the incentives are wrong. And if you get that from the beginning, that really gets your ears up and gets you thinking more about it. And they had the initial 3.4% overall. They had other, again, we call them studies, but these really are just models of what somebody thinks. It's not an actual study. It's not somebody in a lab somewhere running tests on the coronaviruses to determine this. And they were factually, unfortunately, wrong. Or let's just say the models were not accurate. They were not accurate. Usually models, they're not going to be perfect. It's like, okay,
yeah,
can
but
we
they were
get,
wildly wrong.
yeah, well, so normally it's like, okay, we have zero information. Can we get with a model, can we get to a point, to a range that is tighter, and so that we can knock off? So essentially, if you like, is it 100 million people that are going to die? They're like, oh, no, we'll narrow it down. According to our measures, we're narrowing it down to 3.4 million. So if we do nothing, it's 3.4 million versus 100 million or a billion. Like that's really what the models are supposed to do. They're supposed to narrow the range and give us something more useful than what we had before. What ended up happening, though, is 3.4 million, or let's just take the case of Sweden. Sweden, they said, if you do nothing, it's going to be 90,000 people that are going to die within 6 months. That's really scary numbers. They essentially did nothing, especially in the beginning. I mean, they didn't do anything. They did had some measures, right? So let's put facts. They did. You were not allowed to congregate 50 people or more. You know, uh, schools above, I believe it was above high school, the equivalent of high school for us, that were closed. So up until like I think it was 15 or 16 years old, you were there. They stayed open. They did have some measures, but generally speaking, people were going about their lives. And they asked everybody, if you can work from home, just stay home. The only businesses that were closed is if you had 50 people or more. So they did have some measures, right? But generally speaking, with what they did, their model said 90,000 people were going to die within 6 months, and it was 5,000 people.
Yeah, so way off.
That
Way off.
model was not useful.
Yeah.
It just wasn't useful.
So so here's the thing: like these experts, supposed experts, and these people who run these studies, and none of these people have been really put up and interrogated or put under oath and given testimony, in that regard, or have been vouched as experts. Like when you go through a legal process and you call up an expert witness, there is a criteria that they have to go to prove that they are experts in the field or what it is that they're talking about. And so no one's even had to, show their competence. And we're basing policies off of this. And it's just it's wild to me. And then again, like we said, no one really suffers the consequences.
Yeah, the incentives are just wrong, and when I look at the situation, what I see is the incentives are wrong. So a lot of this is being looked at in public opinion, right? And then when you look at in public opinion, when you look at the media, they're not really being critical of them either, just like they weren't critical of the Bush administration and the whole Iraq thing. So the media also, their incentives are not correct, because as we know already, what sells is outrage and politicizing things and getting people to argue with each other because it drives ratings. So if you have the Imperial College guys folks telling you that this is going to be a disaster, media is going to run with it, right? Because that's where their incentives were. So in the realm of public opinion, definitely the people that are supposed to be critical were not.
Yeah, it's wild, and this is where you can see the apparatus really expose itself. You can see the synchronicity across, all these huge institutions to try and maintain a narrative that, and even going so far as, synchronistic censorship of the same kind of people, of the same kind of message. And that's really what's disturbing. We're starting to see the revelation of a totalitarian arm within our control system. And when I think of systems, I do think of them on the spectrum of decentralized versus centralized.
Mhm.
And what I find is that a centralized system is more of a top-down approach to information, and where decentralized system is more of a democratized way of spreading information. And when you look at those two, I see the decentralized system as being um, more functional towards finding out truth, right? Because you have different people exploring their own ideas and their own tests and their own hypotheses, versus a top-down approach where you only get one, and if that one is corrupted, right, it can lead to very detrimental effects. Now,
Yeah, but that's very tough where we live, right? Not where we live. I pretty much mean the world, because almost everything is top down. I mean, if you look at, for example, one of the things that happened here when we were first trying to ascertain how many infections there were, right? How do we run this test? If you remember correctly, a lot of people were talking about, contact tracing and shutting things down so it doesn't happen. But in order to do that, we needed to know the numbers. Unfortunately, due to our laws and how things work here, at least in the United States, there were a number of universities and even individuals, even companies that wanted to create their own test for SARS-CoV-2. And they couldn't. They were threatened specifically by the CDC, who initially botched the test that they created. So it took several
But
weeks for us to have a valid test, and that comes from that top down approach that you were talking about.
and so that's my point, really. It's like, I just want to spread the idea that, first of all, top down centralized approach, where they use heavy-handed authoritarian tactics to keep the control under their belt, is communism, right? It's basically, a communist system in a way, and from the way I look at it, because the apparatus is basically the same. Now, whether the intention is different, to me, it doesn't matter. It matters what the apparatus is used for. And if it's used for violating these like principles which we've founded society upon, then again, like, those are the things that would make something a democracy. And then, like, free speech, freedom to assemble, freedom, especially the free speech aspect, because you are allowed to challenge authority because you know because you live in a democracy where everybody's voice should be heard, and yet they were censoring people. And that's really disturbing to me, especially to see liberals out there applauding this type of approach, right? Because supposedly, right, liberals, I mean, I think most liberals right now are socialists, and socialists are just closet authoritarians at this point. But real liberals, right, people who believe in the values that came out of the Enlightenment, and the values that respect the individual and see the individual as a process for creating human flourishing, right? These they're giving into these totalitarian measures, and that's one of the things that's highly disturbing to me, because it just seems like the cognitive dissonance which people have lived in is taking over their sense making abilities right now.
So there was definitely a push, let's just say, to quickly hand out executive orders, right? At all levels of government. One thing I found interesting was that a lot of the time, our president, Trump, up until, a few days from now, I guess, a lot of people said he was a Hitler and authoritarian. And it was interesting for me to see that he was one of the folks that didn't start coming out with like mandates from the top. Now, for some people, that's a negative thing. Some people are saying he should have taken leadership and should have started controlling.
No, he should have been more of a dictator. I mean, these are what you got. This is what
that's kind of like the argument that they make, right? So that didn't happen, but you definitely did see it across all our different states, how different governors had completely different approaches, right? New York starts locking down. A lot of states start locking down hard. For us over here in Florida, it took a while, but eventually, the order came through, and then it was quickly lifted. And you start seeing the different approaches, and everybody, not everybody, but it's, I think it's roughly 50-50, but a lot of people here were for those, throw down the executive order, lock everybody. And I was like, well, we have 3 branches of government. We've had more than 30 days. So I could see, worst case scenario, even if you want to sort of like, be on their side. Well, if this was really, really, really bad, I could see how, your governor would come in and send this executive order, everybody just locked down. But after a certain point, no matter who you are, you should really want the legislative part of the process to take over and have more people than just one person decide what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so the way I see it is, again, to me, the best approach is a decentralized approach, where people act in according to what they think is the right way to act. And if we're going to have like certain violations of our God-given rights as human beings, then let it happen at a local level where the people have more control. If we're doing this thing at a national level, the people have really no recourse to push back, because things are so far removed from them. And Yeah, so it's actually pretty disturbing to see just the culture of freedom, and the ideas that we have and we value are being totally disregarded for this, like, again, this Orwellian totalitarian mindset now, where it's like, hey, whatever the problem is, it's okay to violate our rights. It's okay for the government to impose upon us all the way up into our bedroom, right? You've had
Yeah.
stories. You've had stories of people not being or the government thinking, having the audacity to tell people, hey, you can't have sex with your wife. If you do, you have a mask on. I mean, like
Yeah, I've seen
outrageous,
those stories. Yeah.
outrageous things like that, right? And
Yeah.
it just seems like people have just rolled over and are taking this, and that's one of the disturbing things that I see. And one of the reasons why I want to get you on the podcast and even talk about this, because I feel like more conversations need to be had like this while we have the chance, while we have the opportunity. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. This is a question I want to get to. But right now, we have an opportunity to speak out a little bit about this and promote the ideas of freedom.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that, because you were saying people are rolling over. And I think there, when people don't know and and there's this emergency and they think that people may be dying or whatever it is, I think people get scared, they have fear, and they roll over easier, right? One of the things I would say is that, start looking at things with the critical eye, and there are sources out there, right? So one of the things I would highlight for folks is that I personally believe that right now that what mainly drives this virus is seasonality, regionality, right? So if you start looking at all the charts of either infections or deaths, and you start looking at it by region. So, for example, you take two states, New York, New Jersey, right? For the people here in the United States, New York, New Jersey. You look at their charts; they're practically identical. And you remember how the governor of New York was taking a lot of credit. He even wrote a book and saying, "Oh, all everything I did, brought down all those infections and all that in New York." And then you see an extremely amount of high infections and deaths in the beginning, and then you see it come down, to extremely, extremely low. And there's where he's taking credit for all of that. And then it takes that giant spike, which is even higher now. But you look at their situation, and you look at New Jersey, which is right there next to them, exactly the same thing. Should their governor also release a book? And you look at all the states in that region, and they have the same curves. And then you look for states that are where we are. You look at Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and you see that it has like a sort of flat in the beginning, then a hump in the middle, then it comes back to low again, and then it goes higher now, more similar to where we were before. But you see that it's the entire region doing that. And after a while, this whole thing of like, people getting tired or not wearing their masks or doing this, which is true. People do get tired after a while. People are like, I cannot live like this anymore. But when you look at the entire regions of multiple states, you see that what's driving it is definitely something else, and it's not necessarily people's actions. And so that would be one of the things that would be one of the things I would highlight to your readers is, just go to like the COVID tracking project, and there you could very quickly just choose a state and see the numbers, and then you can compare it to another state, and it's very graphically, very easily. And this is how you start getting information that you can think of your own, so that you don't roll over, like you say.
Yeah. I do feel like it is kind of a demoralization process, like, as well, right? It's people have been bombarded with fear propaganda. Plus, now you got everybody wearing masks, and you've kind of created this authoritarian culture within our society. And so it's like, man, for me to go out without a mask in Miami, I'm getting approached and accosted 5 to 10 times, at the grocery store or whatever. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things where after a while, you just get beaten down so much, you just kind of like roll over. And but again, I, for me, what I say to people who see this, who see the inconsistencies of the policies versus what is reality, to people who see the agenda, who see what's happening, what I encourage people to do is push back whenever you can. You don't have to
Yeah.
take you don't have to take the weight of the world on your shoulders. uh you know but you can push back when you can. And it's crazy to me that we are not having more liberals join us in this. And I think
It's
that
been politicized. It's just it's
yeah,
been political, and that's really what gets me. It's that it should be it should be a scatter plot of people all over the political spectrum, but because it's been politicized, it's almost like one half is against the other in their opinions, and it shouldn't be. It even if there wasn't. That's one thing I point out as well to folks. If it wasn't politicized this much, people's opinion would pretty much would be a scatter plot like
and
everywhere, and it's not.
yeah, that's the cognitive dissonance, right? And that's where it is. That's how the politicization is the way they inject that cognitive dissonance, right? Because look, anything that Trump says, first of all, like if you believe Trump's Hitler, right, and you believe that Trump is this horrible person, and and the climate is so charged, right, where it's like, no, we have to do whatever we can to get him out of office, whatever it takes. I mean, this is literally the mindset of the Democrats and the liberals. And so it's one of those things where no, whatever Trump says is wrong. So I
Yeah.
have to go against all of that. Oh, he took off his mask. Oh, well, Trump is wrong. I love my mask, and if you don't wear a mask, you're a bad person, right? And I mean, that's basically the mindset that they're talking about.
Yeah, and
And
that has consequences. One of the big consequences that it had for me was so sometimes I try and tune in to the narrative and to the fight, right? And sometimes I tune out because I can't take it anymore. And I remember when he mentioned hydroxychloroquine, right? And I actually had not heard of hydroxychloroquine until he mentioned it. I'm like, what? Because I think that was one of the points where I was tuning out. And then so I like start doing all this research on it, and all the countries that were already using it and had it in their protocols, even countries that had very low death and infection rates. And I started going through that, and I'm like, we should really be looking into this at the very least. But the politicization came, and I'm like, oh man, this is not good. And sure enough, it was something that I feel got put to the wayside.
yeah, so and without a proper scientific exploration, especially when you have doctors, all right, a cohort of doctors across the world talking about the benefits that they've seen using hydroxychloroquine, right? And it's
Yeah.
wild to me that gets censored, and then that gets, even the mention of that gets positioned or in a way that makes the person talking about it some crazy uh some
Yeah,
crazy
some
guy
some
who,
tinfoil hat person.
yeah, and it's like, and this is a medicine that's been FDA approved, and it is over the
Yeah,
counter
it's
in a
extremely popular. It's used to like treat malaria. It's like one of the few medications that like hundreds and hundreds of millions of people have have used. So it like everything, it does have side effects, but it's like doctors and people all over the world have been creating profiles for the risk for decades for this medication. So it's extremely well known.
yes. And so, and that's what I mean. It just seems like this politicization has created a culture where they ignore science, and they ignore the discovery process, and they just base their ideas, their opinions, and their policies on what the party it says is correct. It's all
Yeah.
it's kind of going towards this, hey, whatever this apparatus says, this apparatus that's exposing itself right now, whatever they say is the truth. We don't need to look into this stuff. In fact, anyone who looks into this stuff is not only wrong, but they are bad actors, because the authority has granted the truth, and any question,
Yeah.
and that
You're either evil or you're a useful idiot. I remember I remember having this argument with one of my friends online, and I was like, well, you're leaving me no choice here. I'm either evil or I'm a useful idiot. Which one am I? And for a lot of the times, just asking to just look at the information, and that's why I think, again, to your viewers, to your readers, that there are ways of just looking at simple information that you can feel better and you can think critically about what's going on. One of them is definitely just looking at charts of what's happening with infection rates all over the United States. And just by looking at those charts, you'll clearly see that this is really like a regional issue, because all the states that are in the same area, they more or less have the same infection rates, you know.
So the other part about it also, like a scientific approach would look at this, especially right now, and say, okay, well, the lockdowns are having negative consequences, right? They're definitely unintended consequences that have occurred. And what we've noticed from the virus is that it affects people. It's not indiscriminate, right? It's
Mhm.
it's very discriminate, and it affects the elderly the most, and people with comorbidities
Yeah.
the most.
Yes, yes, yes,
And
yes, yes.
anyone under 50, right, basically has a very trivial risk to dying. Now, there's always
Yes.
outliers, right? There's
Yes,
always
yes. There's
outliers.
always outliers. Yeah. So for folks in their teens, the flu is literally kills more people than, like, let's say, teenagers, right? And
Yeah.
if you're definitely like for college folks, a lot of people are saying, they're out partying, they're not paying attention. It doesn't affect them at all. This really affects this. The age stratification of this is just, it's massive.
Yes.
Like
No.
yeah. And
Let me
let's
just
say,
finish this point, Alain,
yeah.
real quick, because I was just getting it, and I don't want to forget it. The point is, the scientific approach would look at that and say, hey, let's develop policies around this property that we've noticed with the virus, and that is that it is discriminate against
Mhm.
elderly. So let's, folk,
Severely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, to the point where, again, there's no risk to people under 50. So let's focus on policies that work in that way. That way, we've recognized the trade-offs, all right,
Mhm.
and we understand that lockdowns are detrimental to society, and that have consequences where it could be that more people actually die from the lockdowns than the virus. So let's readjust. I would give someone credit if they even approached it that way, but it just seems like it's no lockdown. It don't
Yeah,
matter
that
who you
that's
are.
also missing. Yeah, that's also missing from the conversation. So two things that are missing from the conversation, I believe, was the economic impact. I think that is in there, but is too easily glossed over by the folks that push for lockdowns. And the other one that's almost entirely out of the conversation is how hard this hits elderly folks. Like in Sweden, out of the, I think right now they're probably closer to 7,000 folks that they had like less than 100 or around 100 that were like 50, less than 50 years old that died from it. Their average age of death is like 80 years old, and it's something similar to that is everywhere else. So yeah, this really impacts the our older population, our wise population, right? And the policies, at least I feel, should be targeted towards them, should be targeted towards protecting them. If folks want the vaccine, it should be them first if they choose to take it. um, but that's left out as well. That's left out
Yeah,
as well.
and that's what I'm saying. It's very to me, like, it's a very unscientific approach. People talk about trust the science, trust the science. First of all, science is not meant to be trusted. It's meant to be scrutinized.
Yeah.
It's meant to be it's meant
Yeah.
to be
It's not a
tested.
belief. It's not a belief system.
Yeah, I mean, science has kind of turned into a religion, and just going back, like, to the you know the the breaking down of the logic of it all. We look at the PCR tests, and
Mhm.
PCR tests, there's all types of problems with the PCR test, and then not only that, but the recording of deaths, right? And
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is something that Dr.
It's a big
Burks
question. Yeah.
this is something that Dr. Burks said openly. No,
Mhm.
I don't give any of these people credit, but for anything, I don't think that they're good people. And I don't even know how sincere they are. I mean, it's very obvious that they're hypocrites and they're liars, because I mean
Yeah.
they've
Well, for
it's
the regular folks that may not consider them hypocrites or liars, so I don't know how much your readers are aware of what's going on with the whole PCR test, right? So the whole PCR test, it essentially it tests. You give it a swab, a sample, and then it goes through levels of magnification. And at some point, the magnification, it may not be magnifying anything that's useful. So what's been happening is, and the way I thought about this is, okay, number one, are there any established, even if they're governmental um, sources that agree with sort of what like the far out people are saying? And right now, the story is that the PCR tests are using a magnification level so high that what they're magnifying is not actual live virus. And so you're getting a test positive for something that would never is not a virus. It's just a fragment of a virus. It's a piece of a virus, something that was left over from the virus.
And it doesn't tell you anything really about, especially if it's like, they're taking one virus particle and they're magnifying it, to 1 trillion times or whatever,
Yeah, it's a lot. So we don't have to get terribly technical on it, but there's what they call the cycle threshold, which is the number of multiplications on it. And here's one thing that even Fauci said. So even Fauci is on the record as saying that essentially anything that you multiply more than 35 times is you're just finding dead pieces of the virus and you're not finding the virus itself. What's been happening in the United States is that from all the sources that I have checked and have looked at, and it seems that almost everybody is using 37 and 40 times magnification, meaning that you are definitely getting a whole bunch of cases that are not cases and probably classifying a number of deaths as COVID deaths that are not COVID deaths. Because, if you die and they run a test if they run this PCR test on you with 40 times magnification, and what you really was, well, you had COVID 3 months ago, right? And now you died of a heart attack, you're going to go down as having died of COVID.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really is, I try to highlight to people, is that these death counts that they're first of all, I went on and I looked at the people that died of COVID in my county, where I'm living right now, and the median age has to be like 82 years old. It's crazy how lopsided that is towards, like,
it's very, very lopsided.
Yeah, it's past the average age of death in this country, right? The people that die of COVID is past the average age of death. And so that's what I've known, at least here in this county. It's definitely
I haven't. It's definitely around there. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's that high. It's definitely around there.
And so it's, again, like you were saying, it's the liberal. And when I use liberal here, I use it as the term loosely, right? It's freely classifying people as COVID deaths, and then using a PCR test, which is highly sensitive to giving a positive result because of the magnification process.
Yeah.
And so, these deaths that I can't take that number seriously. Whatever amount of deaths they say that they are, for me personally, when I know that the way they are testing people is suspect of yielding false results, or results that are not really accurate to what we're looking for, right? We're looking for
becomes how is there any like data for folks that want to remain neutral, and is there any data that how do you know this? Like, how do you know this?
Yeah,
I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about people in general. Like, how would they go around finding out? It's like, okay, well, so we know that they're using now this PCR test with a magnification level that's too high. Like, how do we know, or how can we get to know? And, and one of the issues, one of the main things that people are looking at, just briefly, is the all-cause mortality, right? So every year in the United States, people die for whatever reason. If you died, you go on the list. What's happening now is a lot of people are paying attention and seeing, okay, in 2020, was that all-cause mortality a lot higher, right, than when it was for the average of previous years? And they give a weekly count. Here's one thing that we know, at least in Sweden, right? So in Sweden, all of the numbers are indicating right now, and a lot of people put Sweden as having this extremely high death count compared to their Scandinavian members and so on and so forth. All it's preliminary data yet, so it's not 100% sure, but it's looking like this is practically going to be another regular year in number of deaths for Sweden compared to themselves historically and compared to the Scandinavian countries. It's just kind of wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me. I don't know how much you could tell. I mean, of course, if something is going from, I don't know how many standard deviations you'd have to go for there to be an abnormal death count, but if it's within a certain range, I would imagine that you couldn't attribute, it would be hard to attribute that to the virus. It'd say, hey, and then when you look at it from a risk perspective, it's one of those things where, hey, this is in range with what society can accept.
Yeah, with what people accept in their everyday lives, right? So at certain levels is like, okay, if you're within this age range, you have just as much a chance of dying in a car accident. If you're in this age, and there's definitely those levels also missing from the conversation.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. That was one of the main things. Hey, how much of this can society absorb? Listen, we all have to understand at one point we all die, but we can't, because there's that risk of death. We don't tell people that they can't drive on the street, or we don't tell people that they can't fly in a plane, or we don't tell people that they can't do whatever it is that they want to do. And so now is COVID within that range of acceptable risk? And by all means, it looks like it's lower than a lot of things that we accept in our daily lives, especially for the people under 50, right? You probably have more chance of getting killed in a car accident than contracting COVID and dying. If I'm gonna throw that out as a hypothetical, but I mean, given the risk that we have or we know for people under 50, I would
it's in the ballpark. It's definitely in the ballpark for sure. And
so
that's a useful way of looking at it.
Yeah. And so is that worth shutting down society over? And I'm going to say absolutely not, from a practical perspective, right? Because it's going to cause more collateral damage than just letting things take its course and advising. That's the problem. The government is just a bunch of noise right now, or the media too. It's just noise. You can't get a clear signal, right? And so what I would have preferred, real quick, going into this is, man, it would be great if we had a trustworthy source of information and
the fact checkers.
Yeah. Well, not a trustworthy source of information that deems itself to be that, right? But something that has merit, has proved itself through merit. And that is something that I would have hoped that the government and the media would have worked in conjunction in doing. But of course,
unfortunately we don't have that. Yeah.
That's not the world we live in. But I think people think of the government as this benevolent entity that is out there looking out for our best interests. But you could see the amount of contradiction in their story, the amount of corruption, the amount of collusion.
Yeah, they have an incentive as well. And it works for both sides. A lot of people look at, like, for example, a lot of people on the left will look at Trump and they'll see all the things he does and this and that. And I'm somebody that thinks that happens on both sides. If you think it only happens for the opposite side, you're probably not looking at things accurately, right? Whichever side of the spectrum you fall, if you think that only the other folks are the ones who do it wrong or who get it wrong or who have an agenda or an incentive, I would say you might be under your own bubble.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I real quick, let's talk about. I do want to talk about, well, it's kind of going right into that. These institutions, how they can get corrupted. And I just want to point out some examples of that and how, for me, again, the standard that I use is once an institution is showing signs of corruption, it's hard to take anything they say as trustworthy. Even if they're putting out good information, it's still, you have to look at it, everything now at a critical eye. That's the way I operate, right?
You can't passively accept it. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially when we're getting to the point where some of these institutions are promoting really outrageous, unscientific positions. So for
Okay.
instance, like, and I just wanted to kind of go over those positions. Like you have now a movement where they're really trying to advocate that 2 plus 2 is 5, can be 5,
Yeah.
and this has crept into the institutions which people are trusting to give them accurate
Yeah.
information. And I say, how can that be? How can you take these people at face value when this is the type of stuff? Men can have periods. This is now a position being pushed by prominent institutions and government, even to the point where men can have babies. And and there's no difference in biological sex, and it's
Yeah,
just
that's a big
wild.
argument these days. That's a big argument these days. I think recently I don't know if you saw it, but so that has been in I would say the stratosphere of culture for a while, and I think now it's filtering down to every day, to the point that I think the New England Journal of Medicine recently had an article, which is, so the New England Journal of Medicine is very prestigious, right? It's like one of those institutions that you think it, just offers unbiased truth, and it's been that way for a long, long time. They published an article where they were making the case for not identifying babies as male or female when they were born, like literally not putting it on their birth certificate, right? A lot having to do to these theories and philosophies. Since I'm in that field and I like to read structurally where that comes from, that actually comes back from 70s and 80s. People have been talking about this, but now we're here today, actually seeing it in everyday culture.
Yeah, this is kind of the postmodernist process that we're seeing play out, and I would say that that kind of mindset has been slowly infiltrating our institutions and corrupting the knowledge that comes out of there. Because again, it's kind of this thing where now we have to question. Before, we understood the standards in which you used to put out information or reports or
Yeah,
conclusions. And
yeah,
now it seems like this institution doesn't value those standards anymore, and those standards are directly you know attributable to sourcing out the truth. And so if you've abandoned these standards, how can I trust the especially when it's gotten to the point where, again, what I was talking about, how can we trust the information? And I think that is very well seeping into COVID. I think that the institutions that were corrupted by that are also corrupted, that are corrupt in that perspective, are also corrupt when it comes to disseminating out COVID information. So I guess if I could get one thing across, it's like, hey, these institutions that you think you trust, these universities, you
yeah.
might want to take a second look, because they actually think some really crazy stuff, and it looks like they've dropped their standards.
Yeah, if you think back, probably, when we were kids, and it's probably been like that for a long time. They always would get us to think critically, right? And to not just to get the right answer. How did you get it? Show your work so that you can think critically. I think right now we are now in the place where we definitely need to find a way to think critically, not passively accept anything, which a lot of the times it almost gets in there almost by osmosis, and be a skeptic. I think that's almost like the default way folks should be. Number one, because of the politicization of everything these days, but also you see, not to get into it, but you also see like AI coming in and having these deep fakes and all these other um, systems that we used before. If you saw a video of, let's say, like President Obama just giving a speech, you're like, okay, that's President Obama, then you can make up your mind about it. Now you've seen like the deep fake that they had about President Obama, which you can kind of tell is still kind of fake, but it's him, it's his voice talking, and you know that in 5 years you won't be able to know whether it was President Obama or not that gave that speech. And so we're definitely at a spot where we need to think critically. If you can't do that, at least be a skeptic. Don't accept things so
or
easily.
you
Definitely don't accept it passively.
or you're going to be led the wrong direction. It's
Yeah, yeah, that's happening a lot. Yeah,
especially with crypto. We've seen the experts continuously be wrong for the last
yeah,
decade.
yeah,
And this is why I say, people, I get it, especially for anyone that hasn't had, it's a huge revelation, and it's a huge psychological toll to kind of look at things from an objective perspective, because you realize, hey, a lot of what I thought to be true is actually not true, and I have to readjust my worldview. And that's kind of scary, because now, I feel vulnerable. I don't know who to trust. And I've seen people have a hard time, kind of like, when we want to, if you want to describe it as waking up from the matrix,
Yeah.
this world that has been constructed around them through these narratives that they've been, has been ingrained into their psyche from a young age. To have to go back and reconstruct that is a daunting task. And so, you know I feel for them, but if not, you're going to be continuously led. If you don't do that, some of that work, you're going to be continuously led astray, and the stuff you believe is going to become continuously disconnected from reality. It's almost like what Orwell says. It's like, the last commandment of the party was for you to totally disregard anything you know to be true, or I'm paraphrasing there, but
Yeah.
and it's basically that idea. It's like, that's what they are going to command. Like, this is what the apparatus is going to command of you. It's going to say, I am the authority, and I am going to need you to increasingly believe things that are not in line with your reality.
Yeah, I think people still, if they become skeptics, and sort of turn inwards a little bit, and kind of like just drown out, like forget about everything else that's being said. I think most people still have a good sense of common sense. It's just the outside information makes it real difficult to know. But I think if most people can turn inside for a little bit, we're not at the spot where vast majorities of the population are completely gone. But while they're plugged into that source of information, it really does make them confused, and it does make them scared, and it does, you know. And I think that's why a lot of people, if you look at these days, is like, listen, just disconnect, go talk to your neighbor, see if you see them for a real human being, because when you do that, your common sense kind of starts coming back, and you really start feeling not only better emotionally, more connected with other people, but actually your common sense, I feel, makes better judgments.
Yeah. It's very similar, I think, what's happening with COVID, and just clinging on to the official narrative, and despite new evidence, or despite the logic of the situation, or despite reality that you see in front of you. I think there's parallels there to, like, the woke movement. There's
Oh, you want
and
you want to touch a lot of stuff here.
Well, no, I'm just making the parallels to kind of having to, view the world through this lens of, you know, my view is correct, and anyone else's that has a view against my view is an evil person, right? And that is something that's evolving out of COVID. Now that I see that, it's like, if you don't believe the official narrative, if you don't believe that masks prevent the spread of virus, and if you don't believe that it's such a horrible catastrophe, well, you want grandma to die, and you're such a horrible person. And that's the same thing with the woke movement. It's like, you either have to get on board with all this stuff that we say about racism, and about this and about that, and about oppression, or you're part of the problem, right? And so now I'm seeing a lot of people push back against that kind of illogical thinking. And it gives me hope. Like you said, it gives me hope that as more people start to see each other as human beings, and, who are complex, and have, a mind of their own, and make their own thoughts through their own experiences, which you can't tap into because it's a personal thing, that I have hope that humanity kind of evolves past this, and gets through the cognitive dissonance, and that lens that gets put on that, seeing your fellow human beings as enemies.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, with these movements, with these memes, if we want to call them that in some ways, or just with this, a lot of the times, just with anything new that comes along that starts grabbing people en masse, there's generally that first wave. A lot of people go with it, And then generally as it spreads, then people start getting to know it better and start distinguishing better and identifying better what it is. And then oftentimes you get what you're kind of seeing now, which is what we call the pushback, or just people thinking more clearly and better about it, and saying, at first I thought it wasn't that bad, or because a lot of these movements come under the guise of sacrifice and making things better for other people and just being better human beings. But a lot of the times people start realizing that that may not have been all of the push that was behind that, and there might have been components of control that were in it, and you get that a counter movement. And I think right now we're in that counter movement. And it's it has different ways of showing up. There's a reason why all throughout the world you saw a number of, let's say, conservative folks come to power more or less at the same time. It's because there was an initial movement and now the counter movement. And that's why you get Boris Johnson in the UK, and the UK now is going, just it's having the Brexit, and then we get Trump over here, and then we get Bolsonaro in Brazil. These are not disconnected events. Is that there's, for lack of a better word, there are movements or culture wars, and the first one comes in, and now you're getting sort of like the pushback to that. And I think overall we're in a spot where people are not accepting the narratives as easily as before, and are better able to define what is being pushed upon them. I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Well, let me see here. Let me get some predictions from you. Do you want to do that?
we can play that game. I hopefully nobody puts money on my predictions.
So what do you think is okay? So I guess it doesn't have to be specific. It could be a general outlook on how you see things evolving in 2021. Are things get better, or do things get worse?
Oh, in what sense? In COVID?
Yeah, let's just say COVID. Are people wearing masks 6 months from now? Are people taking the vaccine? Are they refusing the vaccine? Is there
Yeah.
is there pushback? Is there what do you think evolves out of this? Because I think we're reaching a very interesting point where we're going to have a change in the power structure in Washington D.C. Right,
Yeah.
and I don't know what that's going to look like. It feels like there's an uncertainty, like the fog of, let's just call it the fog of war. Is I can see 2 weeks out, and that's where my certainty lies. But not now, because I think I don't know when the transition happens, but it should be soon. And then for the 2021, I don't know what to expect as far as COVID and how many people are still going to go along with this all the way out until like 6 to a year out from now.
Yeah, those are good questions, and that's something I don't think that could be. When we say people, I don't think it could really be answered in a general term. What we're seeing right now is that, and even you see a lot of articles, even on, let's say, on left-leaning media, that a lot of hospital staff are not taking the vaccine. One thing I could definitely say is that before, anti-vaxxers, to many people, were sort of like tinfoil hat wearing folks, and you kind of like looked at them, like from the side like that. This whole COVID scenario has made them really strong, which and I think now there's a much greater pushback for the vaccine, and for all vaccines. I think it seems, it has definitely helped out that movement. I think there's always going to be people on either camp. Overall, what I'm seeing, though, and at least what I've seen here in Florida, is that just a lot of people just want to get back to their lives. And I think there's going to be a greater push for that in 2021. So relative to where we are today, short of something else, an actual real threat that makes it worse, I think generally things are going to be better in that regard. You could see, at least for us here in Florida, you could see what happened here in Florida, which was, the governor met with some scientists from Stanford and from Harvard, and after that, everything came off.
That's
Businesses were allowed.
interesting.
Yeah, businesses were allowed to. Businesses. Interestingly enough, also one of the scientists that he met works with this John Ioannidis guy that I was telling you about, and so he met with them. I think it was really more for show. He
Mhm.
may have, and for show meaning that the meeting actually happened like online and you could see it. You can go out to YouTube and see it. He probably had their discussions before and had gotten to that conclusion before, but here you could see, businesses are open, bars are open, there's no capacity, people are on the streets. I would say probably somewhere between 50-50 to maybe 60-40 not wearing masks. But overall, from what I'm seeing, even from my friends, and generally speaking, is that people want to get back to their lives. That friend of mine that I told you that was locked in her house, and started crying when she saw me because she hadn't seen anybody in a month. At one point she just couldn't take it anymore, and now she's been out traveling the country in her van, because she had a van that was her goal, and everything was stopped. So people are getting to a level where they just want to get back to their lives. And if enough of that happens, even under a new administration, I think they're gonna make. If I had to guess, and it's a guess, it's not even a prediction. They might make an initial move to make it seem like they're doing something, and then after that initial move, they'll back off and say, "What we did worked, and now we can go back to normal."
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I, I honestly don't have a prediction.
Yeah.
I'm watching it day by day as I go, and just making adjustments in my perspective where I need to.
Yeah.
Now, you want to? I got some other questions for you, if you're interested.
We're gonna cover the entire universe. I like this.
Yeah, yeah. So this is kind of a controversial question, little taboo question, but
Hmm.
I like to go to those places. What And I like to think in probabilities, right? It's one of
Hmm.
the models I use for trying to forecast. I'm a macro guy. I pay attention to the macro landscape, geopolitics, um, economics, the finances that's happening, the movement of money. And my last question to you is, what do you think are the chances that this was made in a lab?
Oh wow. So we do have that scientist that escaped from China. Um, you know, that's currently looked at as tinfoil hat theory, that it was made in a lab. I don't think that can be classified as tinfoil hat theory. I think, um, and it doesn't have to be malevolent, right? So the fact that it came from a lab doesn't mean that it was on purpose. And I think that's the first distinction people need to make. I don't have enough information. Like most people don't know. What we do know, though, is that, you know, in Wuhan, they were working with it. Um, Me personally, I think there could be a good possibility that it escaped the lab. It doesn't have to be, in order to try and get ahead of something like a possible future infection from SARS, right? So we had the first one. So if you play this out briefly, right, and we had the first SARS infection. Um, the scientists and the Chinese and the CCP starts looking into it. You could easily see how you could be trying to coaxing a virus to mutate into something of what it could be, so that you could have the antidote to that ahead of time. So right, so even just leaving out malevolence, and this was done on purpose, you could see how that could happen. What we do know is that the lab that they had over there was nowhere near as advanced as the ones that we have here on the States. And several reports, objective reports, are out there, from scientists throughout the world, saying this is a disaster waiting to happen, right? So those reports are out there, and people can look for them. And so with that information, you could kind of see how it is possible. We don't know, but it's I don't think is a tinfoil hat theory that this could have come from a lab in China and Wuhan in particular, giving the work that they were doing, giving the reports that are out there specifically saying that this is a disaster waiting to happen. And that's my take on that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I kind of agree. I see it as a real possibility. I think that there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that would at least warrant a serious investigation.
Yeah, we're
Into
never gonna get that.
yeah,
Let's just be clear on this. It's not gonna happen. The communist government in China will control that every single step of the way.
yeah. All right. Well, Alain, I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast and talking COVID with me.
Yeah, this is
I would
fun.
Yeah, I'd love to get you back on again for a catch up session and just shoot the shit again. So,
Yeah, of course.
thanks.
We can talk more about crypto.
All right, sounds good. All right,
All
Alain.
right.
Peace.